Welcome to On the Level, broadcasting from the Blue Ocean Network studios here in Beijing. My name is Fergus Thompson. Now, by some estimates, less than half of China's population profess to be affiliated to a particular religion. But the number of people who do profess some sort of faith is on the increase. And that's even by official numbers, which some people would argue greatly underestimate the case. Now, the Chinese constitution does guarantee freedom of religious belief, but some of those who take up that offer can find that reality is somewhat different. Officially, only 5 religions are recognized in China. They are Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Protestant Christianity and Roman Catholicism. And the state, or more specifically the Communist Party of China, does insist on regulating those involved in religious belief and particularly religious organizations, although it is quite strictly an atheist organization. So what exactly is the state of religion in China in 2014? Well, I'm pleased today to be joined by Dr. James Miller of Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario, in Canada, where he is a professor of Chinese studies and religious studies. He's also written several books on Chinese religion, specifically on Taoism, and has lived and worked in the past in China. James Miller, thanks very much for joining us indeed.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Fergus.
Now, to give some people who may not have as deep an idea of religion in China as you do, something about it, the main religions here, and indeed the numbers of adherents, there seems to be some controversy over those, but what are the main religions?
Yes, so as you said, the main religions are Islam, Protestant Christianity, Catholic Christianity. Interestingly, these are counted as 2 separate religions in
yes, they get 2 bites.
They get 2 bites of the cherry, that's right. And then in Taoism, which is China's indigenous religion, and then Buddhism. And in terms of numbers, Buddhism is by far the most popular religion in China, although it came obviously from India originally. But Buddhism has existed in China since about the year 0, and it's the most dominant, widespread religion. On top of this as well, we also have to think about popular and local religious traditions. Right. And so these are very much community-based traditions. They don't have any official organization, and they don't really have any official status in China. But they're still, especially in rural areas, a deep part of people's cultural life. But they tend to get overlooked because they don't really classify as one of these official religions that people are supposed to somehow belong to. And I think that goes to show one of the complicating factors when we try to count people's numbers of religious believers. Because if we're used to the idea that religion is something that you belong to, and you belong exclusively to one religion and not another, then you can ask people a fairly simple question: are you a Christian believer? Are you a Buddhist? And then you can count this on a form. But I think that the way that in fact religious practice very commonly works in China is that people don't necessarily consider that they are or they belong to a particular religion. This is especially true for the popular religions, for Taoism and Buddhism as well. But if you ask them a different question, did you go to a temple recently? Do you believe in some kind of traditional ideas about morality and fate and fortune? Then you get a very high response rate. But if you ask somebody, are you a Buddhist? This might imply, if they said yes, it might mean that they are very, very serious, strict Buddhist, or they have taken some kind of vows, or they're a monk or a nun. But I think from the ordinary people, they might not consider themselves to be religious with a capital R. But nevertheless, I think we can still observe the continuing influence of these traditional practices and ways of thinking and values in people's life.
So is there some sort of an overlap between, is it a sort of an a la carte, like I'll take a little bit of Buddhism today and a bit of Taoism tomorrow, and maybe even something
yes,
else?
I think that's certainly one way to put it. I think the way, in the academic world we normally talk about this is affiliation-based religions. This would be Christianity or Islam versus client-centered religions. And so with a kind of client-centered religious model, you want some religious service performed, you would go to a temple, you would pay for this to take place. And I think this is the basic way that religion functions at the ordinary, the common level in Chinese society. Last year I was at a big Taoist temple in Shanghai, and there were a lot of people there, and I asked them, why are you, what was going on? And they said, oh, well, today it's the birthday of the Buddha, so we wanted to honor this and have this ritual performed. Then I asked them, do you know that this is a Taoist temple? And and the question was almost meaningless to them, right? And they had no idea that a Taoist temple might look or be slightly different from a Buddhist temple. It wasn't a question that had any deep significance for them. What was important was that they were having this ritual performed. There was chanting. There were lots of people there, and that was why they were there. And so it doesn't, to classify it as one thing or another, it doesn't always work.
Freedom of religious belief, as I mentioned, is enshrined in the Constitution here,
yes.
Guaranteed in the Constitution. What does that actually mean, and how does it play out?
So to believe is one thing, but I think what is controlled and managed and regulated by the government is the practice of religion. So while of course people are free to believe whatever it is that they want, and the state has no interest really in regulating or controlling what it is that people believe in their religious life. The state does have an interest in managing and controlling the functioning of religion, and the main way that this is done is by controlling the spaces where religions are allowed to take place. So, for instance, only in officially licensed places by the state can religious activities take place. This means that in China you can't just walk down the street and hand out religious tracts to people or evangelize people, but you have to allow people to come into the space. Once they're inside the space, then that's fine. But you can't just randomly go down the streets performing religious activities.
But there are 5 officially recognized religions, which is great if you belong to one of those.
Yes.
But apart from those sort of folk or other religions that you mentioned, what happens if you're Jewish, if you're Hindu, Baha'i?
Yes.
Can you not practice in China?
These religions tend to fall kind of in the cracks. So there's a Jewish synagogue in Shanghai, for instance, but it exists simply as a monument at the moment. But recently there have been services allowed to take place there occasionally, and also I think the same is true for Orthodox Christians as well, especially in the north of China, near to the border with Russia. There are some Orthodox Christians there, but again they're not officially registered and managed by the government, and so we can call it a kind of a grey zone, right? So what we might say is that there are officially sanctioned religious venues, officially sanctioned religious places. Then there are religious activities that are totally illegal or prescribed by the state. We can call that black religion, if you like, right? And then there's a kind of grey zone, and these are religions that exist in no officially registered way. But,
let's look at one of those now. The numbers that we get officially here of Christians are something over 20 million, but the numbers from other sources would be up to 70 million Christians,
yes,
let's talk about. Now, a lot of those would not be counted on the official figures because they're these underground churches, both on the Catholic and the Protestant side. What is the difference between them and the ones that are officially sanctioned?
So if you are a registered religious organization, you have some kind of official status, you have a certain kind of freedom to carry out your religious activities in those places. If you're an unregistered church, you don't have any guarantees, right? So there is a lot of unregistered religious practice. The government can be quite tolerant of this, provided that nobody steps out of line or nothing bad happens. But there's no security or there's no guarantee, right? I think for those people, and also then it becomes quite hard to count those people. And then amongst Christians, I would say there are internal disputes between those who are officially registered Christians and those who aren't. So I think think in the earlier time in the 20th century, when there was a time of religious persecution, there were some disputes amongst Christians as to, do we cooperate with the government or do we not cooperate with the government? That era no longer exists in China. There's no era of religious persecution in China, but the memory of this is still quite strong, I think, among some religious communities.
But this rather bizarre situation of a strictly and officially atheist communist party regulating religions to the point where it, if not appointing, certainly approves, for example, a living Buddha or Lama or a Catholic bishop. How does that work within a party which is saying, this is superstition and mumbo-jumbo, yet we will tell you who is going to be the next bishop of Shanghai?
So I think what we have to recognize then is that religions have very powerful social functions, and religions are not just simply beliefs that people have, but they organize people into communities, and they can have some impact in the social world. Religions organize charitable organizations and can sometimes work very well with the civil society, with the state. But I'm sure whatever country you live in, whatever religious background you're from, I'm sure you can easily pick an instance where a religious organization has challenged the authority of the government, or there has been religious strife or violence or controversy. And I think it's from this point of view that the state in China, and probably the state in many countries across the world, has some interest, at least, in managing the times when religions become against the interests of the state. Even in America, this has happened when you have these cult organizations. Remember, there was the Waco cult in Texas, and they stockpiled many weapons, and eventually the government had to storm the compound. I mean, I think there was a case where religions can be unpredictable and radical things, and so I think that in the modern state, the modern civil society, always has some legitimate interest in ensuring that religions, at the very least, comply with civil laws. Right. In my own country, in Canada, we've had an issue with Mormons, or a kind of a version of that, where polygamy is still practiced. And of course, the Canadian Constitution doesn't allow polygamy to take place. This is not something that is special to China, right? I mean, I think that maybe it's more controversial in China, and it's something that is perhaps at the top of people's minds when they think about religion in China. But I think fundamentally there's no enormous difference between China and other countries. It's a degree of difference, right? And of course, for the lives of individual people, the degree
of control, you would say, is much greater here.
Yes,
because of well, there certainly is a worry within the ruling party that any organization that can take people's loyalty can at some stage become a challenge.
Yes, and I think this is particularly true for transnational religions compared to indigenous religions, right? So when it comes to people's allegiances, and so when it comes to border areas, so we talk about Tibet or the far west of China, then of course we have religious organizations that have ties to places outside of China, and then people's allegiances are dominated by these religious affiliations. They understand themselves as being part of a community that doesn't necessarily respect the conventional borders of a political territory. So those religions are in a more problematic situation. I think this can be the case for Christianity and Islam and Tibetan Buddhism. For the kind of mainstream Mahayana Buddhism, that's the kind of Buddhism that has been domesticated and living in China for 2,000 years. This is not an issue, right? But for these religions that straddle borders, it could be an issue.
It's sometimes said that there is what's called sometimes a vacuum or a crisis of spirituality in China since the time of the Cultural Revolution, perhaps, and after that, when what was a fairly strong faith in the party began to wane, and this is given to the rise of interest in spirituality. And do you think that makes fertile ground for more people to join organised religions, or simply to think more on the spiritual side themselves?
I think that's right. I think that when we think about one of the things that religion does is provide people with a set of inspiring ideas for them to devote their lives to. And I think this was certainly identically the case for communism in the early part of the revolutionary period. People were fervently committed to communism. In a way, it functioned from that kind of social perspective like a religion does, and maybe from a kind of psychological perspective as well. So since the period of opening up and reform since 1979, China has become, of course, a country that is not dominated by communist fervour. And I think many commentators have said that the kind of state capitalism that functions in China today doesn't really fill this inspirational gap. It doesn't make people want to get up in the morning and change the world. There's no kind of very deep fervour attached to this, and I think we can say that there's a kind of ennui or meaninglessness, right, to people's lives. Is making money the only thing that is truly important in our lives? Certainly, when people lived in absolute poverty in China, to move into a kind of a middle class, to have some kind of economic security was an enormous was of course what people were absolutely concerned with. But now that people have some degree of stability and economic security in China, the question that people ask is that all? Right, and that could be the same for people living anywhere in the world.
Any society where there is a sort of a lack of spirituality or a spiritual vacuum, if you like, is fertile ground for cults, certainly cult beliefs, and this is not just in China. But recently we had in the news here one cult which claimed in some newspapers here up to 1 million followers, the Almighty Church of Almighty God, involved in a killing. What about the reactions to cults here from the government? There is certain there seems to be sort of a crackdown at the moment on these due to this. Is there fertile ground for these sort of outlying cults?
One way to think about this is religions are always being created. Right, and religions are, and one way to think about cults is problematic. Is that they are simply a new religious movement, and very often these attract enormous numbers of followers and then die away. But they can command a deep psychological loyalty from people and can become socially dangerous. And these things have happened throughout history. They happen across the world. They're impossible to prevent. This seems to be a kind of normal thing that occasionally happens in societies across the world. Now, the Chinese government has taken a kind of an unusual step, I suppose, or at least unconventional from our point of view, of saying that of creating a classification of dangerous cults. And so if some religious activity gets put into this category, then it can be actively proscribed and stamped out.
That's certainly a logical, practical reason. In terms of, but again, in recent news, there's been, it seems, some antagonism of not underground but official Christian churches in the city of Guangzhou, which is known for its Christian inhabitants, the number of them. Why do you think this move to antagonize a group that seem to more or less follow the rules?
So I think the government is particularly concerned about the power of Christianity compared to other religions, and I think there's perhaps a historical reason for this, which is that the arrival of Christianity, at least Protestant Christianity, in the 19th century was associated with European colonialism, and there was amongst amongst reformist and revolutionary writers in early China, there was a very strong anti-Christian emphasis. They saw Christianity as being the religion of the people that brought opium to China, as a religion deeply associated with colonialism, not really having a deeply positive role to play within, in Chinese society. So I think that's there's at least something, there's a kind of a historical background, I think, that still can influence government thinking about this. There's been, let's say, a history of nervousness and about Christianity that, of course, does not attach itself to Buddhism or does not attach itself to Taoism in China.
People travelling to China for the first time might be surprised to notice that you can find Arabic script on the currency here, that there are people in the streets wearing small white hats, and there are mosques in many cities. That Islam is one of the larger religions in China. Now, until recent times, that has been a fairly benign relationship, but with the situation in the west of China, where there have been terrorist attacks and these have been associated, do you feel there's a danger of a more extreme type of Islam growing and expanding in China, particularly in the West? Well,
I think that China has not been immune from this particular kind of brand of Islam that we have been experiencing in the West as well. And I think there's a kind of tension here between a deeply felt Muslim idea of creating a community of Islam, of enacting Islamic laws, and at some level, there's a kind of conflict between that or the question is, how do you be a Muslim in a country that is not a Muslim country? That's a kind of a problematic question. And largely, this is, at least in the 20th century, this was relatively peaceful situation. But in the 19th century, there was enormous bloodshed in the west of China between Chinese and Muslims in the far west of China. And so for this reason, this has been a historically problematic situation. And so perhaps what is happening today is not, of course, is inflected by new versions of Islamic radical ideologies, but is not something that is totally unheard of or unprecedented. And of course, this is a deep worry for the Chinese government
we should point out
for obvious reasons.
There's actually an ethnic group, an officially identified ethnic group called Hui in China, who essentially you are by default Muslim if you are born a Hui in the Hui ethnicity, and these people look like other Chinese people in the center of the country.
So Hui people are basically Chinese people who have at some point in their lives converted to Islam, and the Hui people are their way of living in China has been very, let's say, compatible with Chinese norms and Chinese customs, and there's not so much tension between Hui people and the government. This is more the case in terms of the Uyghur and other smaller minority nationalities. They speak a language that is not related to Chinese ethnically. They're very different, and they're much closer to the people in the former Soviet republics in that part of China, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan,
and indeed Pakistan,
and Afghanistan as well.
Now, those at some stage or other are all sort of, if you like, foreign religions that came at an earlier or later date to China. Your particular interest is in the area of Taoism.
Yes.
And this is what we would say China's indigenous religion. Can you tell us a little bit about Taoism, very simply, for people who may not be that aware of what it involves?
The underlying idea of Taoism is the idea of Tao. Tao just means the way, and this is the source of life, of vitality that makes the world alive, that gives us energy in our bodies, makes the world into a living place. And so Taoists basically celebrate Tao as this underlying source or principle of vitality that allows people to live. So it's a kind of a fairly life-affirming affirming religion, and it has a deep connection to the natural world as well, because these energy that flows within the body also flows within the natural world as well. And Taoists have traditionally sought a kind of harmony between the body and the natural world. And this is not just a kind of religion, but it's also deeply inspired Chinese painting and art, and it's a kind of very deep-seated value within Chinese culture, even though perhaps not many people identify as Taoists.
Your latest book is called Religion and Ecological Sustainability in China, and in this you look at the influence of Taoism and a very hot topic, the environment in China. How do you see these two interacting?
It's clear that our modern industrial society is not ultimately, in the long run, sustainable. As the world's population approaches 9 billion people, and as people in China and India and Africa become very wealthy and become consumers, I think it's not possible that this way of life that we've created that can be ultimately sustainable. So the question is, what other kinds of cultural values are there? What other ways of thinking are there about what is our place in the world that can help usher in a kind of new culture of sustainability? And so one of the things that people like me are interested in is looking at can religions be positive forces for helping to bring about this change in consciousness, or maybe they're negative forces as well. But I think that one thing we can say is that people's religious values, their ethics, can play some role. Maybe positively, maybe negatively, but at least is a factor in helping to create a new way of living in the world, and which is more sustainable.
Apart from these more recognized or organized religions, there is, of course, in China a great deal of what might be in some circumstances called superstition, in others would be called traditional beliefs. Right. People seem to be quite happy to follow these local traditional beliefs. Yes. Do they play a big part in the way that Chinese people think about spirituality? Things that have been handed down from generation to generation and very much ancestors.
Yes, I think this is, quite surprising, perhaps, that even though society has modernized, many people live in the cities, they have a lifestyle that, to all intents and purposes, looks a kind of a modern international lifestyle. In fact, these deeply held beliefs and values from traditional Chinese society still continue to influence people's way of thinking. I think one of these is a kind of almost like an ethical idea, which is that may be related to karma as well. Like, if you do something good, then something good will happen to you. And if you do something bad, then something bad will happen to you. I think another one is the idea of feng shui, right? So that the idea that the placement of buildings, tombs, objects can have some positive effect in bringing about good fortune in the world.
In many developed countries, particularly in the West, there seems to be a general decrease in certainly organized or more fervent religious belief. In developing countries, an increase. Now, where would you see China? We've seen these figures at the moment, controversial as they are. Do you see China as a country that is going to be more or less religious in 25 years' time, whatever that religion may be?
That's a very interesting question. I think one of the important factors that we have to think about is urbanization. So China is a rapidly urbanizing country. China is a country that where at the moment about 50% of people are classified as urban residents, and about 50% of people as rural residents. Not only 20 years ago, it was 80% rural and 20% urban, and maybe in another 20 years or 30 years it will be 80% urban and 20% rural. So many traditional Chinese beliefs are tied to the land, and tied to rural society, tied to traditional society. And so when you have this process of rapid urbanization, people move to cities, their traditional ways of life are disrupted. And I think this, the effect of this upon people's religious affiliations and beliefs, I think, is not clear. For sure, this must have a very profound effect upon people's cultural values, their beliefs, and their practice. What we know so far is that the practice of traditional religious activities goes down. but that when you ask people about the persistence of these traditional ideas, we find this in things like feng shui and these ideas of moral reciprocity. We find these things still persist. Mm-hmm. And so the space in which people practice their religious life is, of course, being totally transformed. Mm-hmm. So something new will happen, right? And that this is the great story that I'm looking forward to over the next 20 years.
Well, just what that new thing is, we'll perhaps come back in 20 years and find out. Dr. James Mueller, thank you very much.
Thank you, Fergus.